I do want to bring in trial attorney Brian Claypool to talk more. And Brian, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Yeah, good morning. Great to be with you.
So I wanted to start off with the fact that there was just a little bit of a delay in Luigi Mangione's arrival, or at least the proceedings. There seemed to be a delay as to when the pretrial hearing did get underway. Is that significant, and what may have caused that delay?
Yeah, I don't think it's significant, and the likely cause of the delay is probably witness availability, because there are going to be some witnesses being called in this hearing, and if witnesses, for example, are running late, they can't be there on time, then the court would likely wait a little bit for the witnesses. So I think that's probably what's happening here, but not a big deal.
I also wanted to ask you, because typically we do see Luigi Mangione walking, shackled, but, many times in civilian clothes into the courtroom itself. And I did want to bring in this live look once again for our viewers. So this is the vantage point that we typically see. This is the hallway leading into the courtroom. However, that didn't happen today. We didn't see him walk through the hallways. We just got word that he was inside the courtroom itself, bypassing that media row. Can you explain perhaps the reason behind that, as we've seen him do so previously?
Yeah, my guess would be that the lawyers for Mangione are being more mindful now of using him to pander in front of potential likely jurors, for example. Like at past hearings, he's almost reveled in the fact that he's got people looking at him. And there's been an argument made by prosecutors in both the state and federal case that his lawyers are trying to pander to potential jurors. So I think that Mangione's lawyers now are a little bit more mindful of that, and they're less likely to parade him around outside the courthouse, in the hallways, to avoid being accused of trying to impact a jury pool.
And what's also interesting is we were sharing this live look with our viewers. We were seeing some supporters of his walking into the courtroom. We saw even live looks outside the courthouse as folks were donning attire. They were waving signs in support of Luigi Mangione, lending to your point that, there seems to be almost like a circus surrounding this case, and the attorneys might be mindful of that. As we take a live look, though, from inside this hallway right here, we see at least 3 police officers. And I did want to pull up once again this photo right here. So this is a photo, Brian, that Fox 5 New York provided. This was just moments ago from inside the courtroom itself. And at least from this vantage point, you can see a very heavy police presence. But as you're taking a look at it, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring it in full for our viewers so they can get a better view of this. But when you take a look at this particular photo, Brian, as this is happening, is there anything that you can extrapolate from this photo? We see that Luigi Mangione right now is dressed in civilian attire. We see heavy police presence. He's chatting with one of his attorneys. What do you glean, if at anything, from this photo?
Yeah, great question. I think Mangione's lawyers are trying to portray him to the judge as, hey, look, he's just an average human being. He's dressed up nicely today. He's not in his orange jumpsuit. His lawyers, I think, also won a request to have at least one of his hands not be handcuffed so that he'd be able to write and take notes. So expect him to be jotting down notes as well. He's talking to his lawyers. He's being engaged. They want to portray him as, hey, look, he's just like your next door neighbor. This can't be a cold-blooded murderer. And then the police presence, is likely because of what you've mentioned at the onset, which is he's had a lot of people like wanting to say hi to him, kind of grab at him. They think he's a hero for having murdered somebody. So I think all of this is part of a ploy on the part of his lawyers to, in my opinion, create some type of juror nullification. What does that mean? That their hope is that Mangione can bond with potential jurors and actual jurors when this goes to trial and come off like the average guy next door, so that the jury likely ignores some of the critical, tangible forensic and DNA evidence in this case, and in hope of getting one or two jurors to acquit for a hung jury.
I mean, even taking a look at this particular snapshot in time, his demeanor, his facial expression, it almost seems a little relaxed. He, is having this, conversation with his attorney who looks much more serious than him. I have to imagine his attorneys are coaching him on how to present himself to the jury. And this is a critical pre-trial hearing right now, Brian, because his attorneys are looking to get some evidence suppressed in court, including the items in his backpack, some of the statements that he has made to police. I wanted to start with the items in the backpack first, because is there a gray area in the law? Do police need to have a warrant before they search anything? Or is there a legal argument on the side of police allowing them to search before they present a warrant?
Yeah, so typically, there's really two reasons why a warrant wouldn't have been necessary here. Let's go through that. Let's talk about the backpack first and keep out the statements that he made. So usually you would customarily need a warrant to inspect his backpack, right? Unless there is what's called exigent circumstances. What does that mean? It means that the police officers felt like Mangione might pose a risk of harm, for example, to somebody else, somebody in the McDonald's where he was picked up, or he might pose a risk of harm to them. Could there have been something in the backpack that might have caused harm to others? One of the police officers is going to testify she thought he might have a bomb in the backpack, right? So if there's exigent, which means an immediate fear of harm to others, then you don't usually need a warrant. Like, for example, I get pulled over driving. They suspect, a DUI, and they can potentially look in the back trunk of the car as well, because they think I might pose a harm to others on the freeway. So that's one angle. Then look, worst case scenario here, that Mangione's lawyers win and on this first argument saying, look, you didn't have a warrant, there was no exigent circumstances. The way that the prosecutors can get in this evidence on the second evaluation I'm going to make here is a standard of whether they could have gotten this evidence through a search warrant. What does that mean? Well, that means if prosecutors had waited a day and they filed a probable cause affidavit with the judge and said, we want a search warrant on Mangione's backpack, there's no chance in a million years that a judge would not grant that. A judge is going to grant that. So the prosecutors are going to argue, we would have been able to get this evidence anyway had we gone and gotten a search warrant. And that's where I think they're going to prevail on this. If I had to prognosticate, it's 50-50 on the exigent circumstances. But look, they would have been entitled to go in and search that backpack with a bona fide search warrant. So that's their other angle on how to get to the evidence there.
So let's talk about the statements that Luigi Mangione made to police. His defense attorneys are arguing that he started speaking and, officers were questioning him before they indicated that he had a right to remain silent. In the eyes of the law, how do those arguments pan out?
Right. So what your viewers have to remember is the Miranda rights, the rights that you have a right to remain silent. Those don't need to be administered unless there's what's called custodial interrogation. What does that mean? Well, for example, you're in a police department, right? You're in the back of a police car and you're being asked questions by a police officer. That constitutes custodial interrogation. Or for example, if for example, Mangione was handcuffed here and then he was asked questions, then he would need to have his Miranda rights read. But look, if he's sitting in McDonald's, right? And these police officers are having a conversation with them, they haven't handcuffed him yet, they haven't arrested him yet, then arguably they didn't need to read Miranda rights at that point. Once they handcuff him, say, hey, look, we're taking you in, then they've got to read the Miranda rights. So that it'll be important to find out this hearing, when exactly was he handcuffed? When was he brought into custody and put into the police car, and were questions asked before or after that.
Which is interesting because I'm not sure a lot of people even know that. So let's say you just have a normal conversation with an officer. They don't have to read you your rights. It's only after maybe they arrest you, you're put inside the police car. That is when, the clock starts ticking, I suppose, when they have to indicate that you have the right to remain silent. When you take a look at these arguments that the judge is now hearing, typically, in these arguments, does a judge traditionally side with the prosecution or defense, or is it 50-50?
Yeah, great question. I think it can't be determined in a vacuum. It's got to be looked at on a case by case analysis. The starting point for the judge on whether statements made by Mangione come into evidence is where did it take place? Remember what we talked about. It didn't take place at the police station. So that favors prosecution. He's sitting, I saw some pictures, he's just sitting at the McDonald's and these two police officers are talking to him. Remember, I advise clients and friends, if you get pulled over and you're being questioned by the police, you don't have an obligation to respond at all. So, but Mangione's having a conversation with them inside of McDonald's. So the judge is going to look at that. That favors the prosecution, right? Because it's not really custodial interrogation. And again, I think the key point is going to be, at what point do the police officers say, hey, look, we're taking you in. Hey, can you turn around? I'm going to put handcuffs on you. At that point in time, that's when it's going to trigger the Miranda rights to be read. And so I would need to hear, for example, when exactly was he handcuffed? When was he told he was going to be taken into the station for further questioning? If they told him that, then they can't continue to ask him more questions.
So does the line of questioning, impact or influence any of this? Could the police have even asked him point blank, did you kill Brian Thompson? But they haven't handcuffed him yet. And then he responds. Could that, be prior to? So the line of questioning doesn't have anything to do with it. It's about whether he is in, custody, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's what good law enforcement would do, right? I mean, if you've got a lead on this guy who allegedly in cold blood allegedly murdered Brian Thompson, and you see him sitting at a McDonald's, if I'm a cop, I'm going to walk in there. I'm going to chum up with this guy. I'm going to order an Egg McMuffin, sit down, chat with him, not tell him we're taking you into the station, not telling him you're under arrest, and let's see if he's smart enough to not say anything. So they could have clearly asked him before handcuffs, before saying I'm taking you into the police station, did you kill Brian Thompson? Is this shell casing we found, does that match what you have inside your backpack? If he made any kind of admission of guilt prior to police, detaining him, putting him in handcuffs, taking him into the station. Look, prosecutors are going to be all over that, and they're going to say that's fair game. That's an admission of guilt.
So is this almost like the last chance opportunity for the defense as they're trying to, get some of these legal wins? Are they just exhausting, every option and kind of just throwing something at the legal wall, seeing if it sticks?
Well, look, you've got to weigh what's in that backpack, right? To prove a murder case, it's critical to have the weapon, and it's allegedly in the backpack. So the evidence that you're talking about this hearing is absolutely crucial. I mean, this is going to have an effect on the federal case as well. This ruling will likely affect the federal case. So look, prosecutors got to be very serious about this. They have got to make sure to ensure that physical evidence, right? You have the silencer that was found too, the gun that was in the backpack that matches, by the way, through ballistics, the shell casings that were found at the scene of the crime. I mean, if you're going into a murder trial, you want to have all that tied together very nicely. So the prosecutors, they don't want to lose this evidence in this case. So this is a really crucial hearing. Look, at the end of the day, if they lost it, I don't think that's going to happen. I think ultimately the judge is going to not exclude it, but let's say the judge did. They still do have some, physical evidence at the scene of the crime that ties Mangione to the shooting as well.
And Brian, I'm curious because, as you mentioned, these decisions, aren't made in a vacuum. For this particular judge, do you have, any indication from the previous decisions that this judge has made, kind of what that perhaps mindset might be?
Yeah, that's another great question because frankly, I was surprised by this judge's previous ruling to throw out the terrorism charges. Remember, Mangione was charged in state court with murder through terrorism as well, which would have really amped up his penalty, and that would be very powerful to a jury too, right? Let's say you're sitting in a jury and you hear the word, "Hey, this was a terroristic act." That really is going to carry a lot of weight. And where I was surprised was the judge making such a ruling without having more evidence, like a 2 or 3 day hearing on this. I think he ruled on it basically on the papers. And how do you do that without having people come in and testify, law enforcement come in and testify, talking about this alleged manifesto, that this was some kind of a mandate by Mangione to go after healthcare providers, So I was surprised by that. I thought that would be a decision made much closer to trial, right? Once you've developed the evidence, you've seen all the evidence. For that ruling to come so quickly in the case, that was surprising. So back to your question, that could potentially favor Mangione in this hearing because you've got a very fair-minded and potentially liberal judge on this case.
It'd be really interesting. And, they're saying that this hearing could take days. There's a lot of evidence and a lot of testimony to go through. So it will be interesting to see how all of this pans out. Brian, we appreciate, as always, you coming on and giving us your legal expertise.
You bet. Thank you.